We need to talk about a problem that can be encountered because of the scope chain, and that is the inadvertent creation of global variables. Now first, I want to emphasize what is wrong with global variables. We have learned that the first execution context established is the global execution context. So if that is where all of our code is run to start with, what is wrong with taking advantage of the variable environment it provides and creating global variables? And that's a valid question. And we do use global variables. But let's look at some reasons why we should avoid them as much as possible. So first, we've already talked about this earlier, but global variables can lead to memory leaks. We talked about garbage collection, and a global variable will not be garbage collected because it can be used at any time in the program. But it's very possible that we've created a global variable for something that we no longer need, and therefore it's taking up memory that could be garbage collected. Now, another disadvantage is that global variables can be changed anywhere. Now, the irony of this particular disadvantage here is that many times that's seen as an advantage, and that's why global variables are used, especially by new JavaScript programmers. Making something global is an easy way to solve a problem. Well, if we make it global, we can access it anywhere. We can change it anywhere. We can work with it anywhere. But the fact that we can change it anywhere means that it could be changed inadvertently. We could do something that would change that global variable without intending to. And that would cause unintended consequences, bugs that would be hard to track down. Therefore, we need to try to avoid that. Now, a related problem is that global variables can cause collisions. So if we're creating a lot of our variables on the global environment, it's possible when we start loading other libraries or we have other programmers working on a project or something like that, that the same global variable is used somewhere else. And that would cause a collision. Those two obviously can't represent two different pieces of data. So one will overwrite the other. So that can cause a problem. And then finally, this is a disadvantage that I think we need to talk about, perhaps one that's not mentioned as often, but when we use global variables, especially as a new programmer, it impedes our modular thinking. We rely on that global variable to solve problems, and we don't think in a sense of modules, of smaller pieces of code, self-contained pieces of code. So I think that's a problem with global variables as well. Now, there's a section later on where we'll talk about modules, and so we'll dive into those more deeply at that point. But I think it's important to point out that if we rely on global variables too much, we don't think in that modular fashion. So those are some disadvantages to global variables. Now let's look at how they can be created and this danger of the scope chain where we can inadvertently create a global variable. So here's some code where I've actually created 3 global variables. A few of these I think are pretty obvious. You can see them right away. Obviously the first one, enlarge it, that's created because we declared it. We declared a global variable and we assigned a function to it. So that's one way that global variables are created. But then there's 2 other ways shown here. Now, what I'd like to do to illustrate these ones is I'm going to run this code inside the console. First, we're going to look at the global variables, then we'll run the code, and then we'll look at global variables again. So let me open up the console here. Now we can see that enlarge it is on the global space. We can access it. We can see that it's a function. We could invoke it. But what about large num and larger num? It looks like they're not on the global space. Well, the reason they're not is because we haven't invoked this function yet. Once this function gets invoked, let's see what happens. So we'll call enlarge it, and we should call it with a number, and that returns a very large number. Now if we look on the global space for large num, we can see it's available, and larger num is also available. They're both now on the global space. If we look at the global object, we can see both of them sitting there. Now back to our code. How were these created? Well, the first one was created because we declared it as such. The second one, large num, was created inadvertently because we did not declare it inside of the function. So what happens is that scope chain is used, and it looks for large num inside of this function, and it hasn't been declared there, so it goes up to the next part of the scope chain, which in this case is a global environment, and it doesn't find it there either, and so it declares it. So it makes it a global variable on the global space, and then it assigns that value of 1000. Now this one, we simply assigned it to the global object. Because we assigned it to the global object, it is a global variable. So we have to be careful of that as well. Thinking, oh, well, I have this global object I can use. If I assign something to it, I can access it in another part of my program that may not be connected. Well, and that's the thinking that caused us to create these global variables. And so we take advantage of that global object. But really what we're doing is we're just creating a global variable as if we had declared it as a global variable. So some things to be aware of with the global variable and how we can create a global variable inadvertently by not declaring. So we always need to declare our variables. Let const or var. And that will then restrict their scope to either the function or the block. All right, let's move on to the next topic.